So please, let me welcome you, say hello. I'm very happy that I'm here. It's the first time that I speak here in this very place and building, and I'm very glad to be here. So let me start by saying we have war in Europe again. And I personally did not believe that this would come true. Although it was foreseeable for a long time, I could show you the series of books and articles and so on that I collected within the last 2 decades about this unsolved situation, and many people were aware of this, how can I say, growing density. And for me, before I say anything else, I want to say that it's always so hard to understand why there is so little will to come to solutions without weapons. And when now all over the world, and especially in Europe, people talk about a turning point in history. So our chancellor, the German chancellor, he opened the session in parliament by saying, this is a turning time. This is a turning point in history. Then my question is, where do we turn to? Are we going to turn backwards? Does turning point mean, okay, we made an error by not having enough weapons, by not having enough soldiers? Let's now get more weapons and more soldiers in order to be able to fight more and better wars in the future. Please forgive me for putting it so simple, but in a way I think it's simple. You know, I'm not talking about the Netherlands. I don't know enough about your very beautiful and very interesting country. I just have a couple of friends here, been sometimes in the Netherlands, but not enough to talk about the Netherlands. So for a moment, let me talk about Germany. So now, within days, the German government decided to take another 100 million euro for our military. And in the future, to raise the budget of the military by 48%, so nearly double the budget of the military. And I would say if we would have invested all this money in solving the problems that military can solve, we would be much, much better off. Because the problems you all can see, and we all can solve them. And military and war is never a solution. But let me also say this war was begun by Russia. It was begun by Putin. I'm always a bit reluctant to say Russia. I will use the term in the future in this talk. I will also talk about Ukraine, but I want to, for one moment, raise your attention at the fact that we live in a time where we can't really go on thinking and talking in this manner. I know that there are so many people in Russia who don't want this war. So many people in Russia. So it's not Russia, it's this Russian government. And let me also, although you might find this a bit strange, let me also add one slight element to how I see the crisis. One element is that the Russian leader, Mr. Putin, who came into office more than 20 years ago, he's now in office for a very long time. And I realized this by many, many people being in office at so high top rank positions, that they get more and more isolated because no one tells them the truth. They have around them, they have only people who tell them what they want to hear. I was in a meeting with our German chancellor one day on a specific issue. I'm not going to go into that, but I made a proposal. And the chancellor asked his advisors what they think about it. And they all became red. And nobody spoke. And then he said, but you are paid to give me advice. So what do you think? One could possibly say that. So the problem was that the idea made sense for them, but they didn't know whether it was appropriate to admit that. So very often we have this fact, and with Mr. Putin we have a specific fact that he was such a virophobe. He was so afraid of the virus that for 2 years he nearly met no physical person. Maybe you've seen the meetings with his ministers where he sits here on the table and then far where the building has already ended, the others would sit. And when he meets Macron or Scholz, it's the same. He's so afraid. So for years now, they haven't met. They haven't talked to each other. They've talked about each other with those who have the same opinion. And I'm quite sure that what the idea was in Russia has very little to do with the reality in Ukraine. And maybe you remember this scene where he asked, Putin asked the chief of the, Secret Service in Russia, whether he would agree to starting the war. He didn't call it start the war, he said this special operation, whether he would agree to the special operation to free the Russians in Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And the leader of the Secret Service said, "Niet, da. So he said no in the first moment. And then he corrected himself. And he said, of course, yes. And Putin said, say it again. And he said, yes. And he said, say exactly what you mean. And he said, yes, I am for the war in Ukraine. No, this was not my question. And then he said again, we will do special operations. Say yes to the special operations. So he said yes to special operations. And you could just by watching this scene, you could understand that this is not the conviction of this person. Not at all. But it was enough for Putin to hear what he wanted to hear, and not what the person really felt and thought. Let me say one thing more. Now, there are these Russian troops in Ukraine, and there are tanks that shoot at houses. There are people who sit in cellars, sit in underground stations, who flee the country, children who had to flee alone, people who gave their children away because they were afraid of what would happen to the children. And there are people dying every day. It's extremely terrible, and it is unacceptable in every sense. If you look at how this could happen, then we come to a couple of unsolved problems in Europe. In European history, it depends on how deep we go. There are different layers of the problems. And I would like to look at some of them together with you. One problem is that in 1922, when they made the borders within what at that time was the Russian Empire, they made the borders in a very specific way. I take another example for a moment. I take the example of Armenia. Because you remember, this was the last war that we had. It was less reported in our media, but it was terrible, also very terrible. And there is a part that historically was a part of Armenia in the last population count in 1908. 92% of the people living there were Armenians, But then when they had their All Unions conference, it was given to Armenia, but Friday night, Stalin arrived. And Stalin changed the borders. Not only this one, he changed a couple of borders. And he gave that part to Azerbaijan. And we have the same with Ossetia, which was then a part of Georgia. We have the same with Chechnya. We have the same with the Oblast of Donetsk and Luhansk, which was given to Ukraine, although it was not Ukrainian. So the idea was divide et impera, not make them strong. And it was always to create trouble and tensions so that they would not be strong against the central power in Moscow. That was one of the ideas. And the moment the Soviet empire collapsed, at all these places where there was this evil thinking in making borders different from what history and the people had brought or wished, all this came up in wars, in attacks, and so on. One element. Ukraine, Putin says this is no country. In Russian, Ukraine means at the border. So when Putin says Ukraine, he always, or Russians understand, at our border. And he always tells his fellow Russian people, this is a part of Russia. This is where Russia began. So he goes back very far in history and says, where this started, that is Russia. We had the same, let's say, when Yugoslavia collapsed. For example, Milosevic saying, wherever Serbs lived in history, wherever Serbs lost their blood and the blood was down in the earth, this still is Serbia and will be Serbia for all times. So where you link a social form to blood and soil, you're always in evil. And in Ukraine, we have the problem that this is a country where we have different parts of population. We have a lot of Ukrainians. This is an old country with an old history. This is a language of its own. But in the east of Ukraine, we have more than 90% Russians. And then we have Polish people and we have Tatars in the south and so on. And let me look at two things now. One is that we had war, civil war, in Donetsk and Luhansk for a long time. We had a real war in 2014. We then had a ceasefire, and we had two treaties, the two treaties of Minsk. And the treaties said they should be given autonomy. Within 2 years, they should have an election, vote for their own government, and decide on their own way. But this was just paper. They were never allowed to do that. And so there, the frustration and aggression became bigger and bigger. This was then an argument for Putin saying, we need to help them. Because the quite weak at that time Ukrainian government did not have the strength to say, let's give them autonomy. Because in Ukraine, there are strong right-wing nationalist groups that say this would be I don't know the word in English. This would be terrible. We would give our soil, our country away, and so on. So therefore, it was unsolved for all this time. But this is only one layer. And another layer is that if you go back to history, if you go back to geopolitics, to books having been written in the last decades, even books that have been written in the first part of the 20th century, many authors say, Ukraine, this is the very heartland of Eurasia. And those who conquer, who have this land, they will conquer Eurasia. So the continent of Europe and Asia, where always the fear was if they come together, then they will be stronger than everybody else. Especially from the American side, the US side, this was always a fear. We have to keep Germans and Russians, Europeans and Russians in distance, because if they work together, they will be stronger than we, the only leading world power. And on the Russian side, the same idea. This beautiful land, this very rich land with this very rich soil that is overwhelmingly fertile, and this very gifted population has for a long time in history always been like on a chessboard and the big powers playing with them. And they have paid tribute to all of them. They have lost millions in the Holodomor, in Stalin's time. They have lost again millions in Second World War by the war that was brought by the Germans to them. They've lost more than 1.5 million Jewish people, because Ukraine was one of the centers of Jewish life in Europe. And they were nearly all killed, or they left to Palestine or to other places. And then there was Chernobyl. You all remember that? It's a country that really had to pay a lot. And then in the last decades, it was always the question, will it be ours or yours? So East and West fought about Ukraine. And if I'm allowed to say this very simple, not to go too deep into it, I would just say that this kind of thinking should be over. Ukraine should be allowed to decide itself how Ukrainians want to live, how they want to organize their society, their political life, their economic life, what their neighbors and friends and partners are. It's not others that can or should decide that. Let us all go back for a moment. Let us all go back to the year 1989. Until 1989, this continent was divided, completely divided. And we had the wall and the Iron Curtain. We had the wall in the middle of Berlin. We had it in the middle of Germany. I had friends on both sides of the wall. I had a band, a music band, when I was young. And one day we were looking for a new guy playing the bass because we lost our bassist to England. And a young man showed up, long hair like me, a wonderful musician, brilliant bass player. And you know where he came from? He came from Eastern Germany. And you know how he came? He was a great musician. He wanted to study music in East Berlin, but he was not allowed to because he had long hair and he was critical towards the government. So one day after the rehearsal with his band, they met in a restaurant. There was a table with 4 chairs. In the middle of the table, there was a light, small light on the table. In the middle of the light, there was a microphone, and there was a cable going to the next room. And everything they were talking was recorded on a tape recorder. And they were criticizing the system. He had to go to prison for 4 years for what he said to his friends. What he did in prison was, he understood that he was wrong, completely wrong. He didn't know enough about the society and about politics. He was influenced by bad guys, and he then learned, and he was completely convinced that socialism was the final aim of history and that the German Democratic Republic was the best ever possible form to realize socialism. And he said, I want to fight for my country. I want to defend my country against the capitalists. And they believed him. So after 3 years, he was allowed to leave prison, and he became a member of the National People's Army, as they called it. And he was so good in the army, especially in his thinking, in his clear ideology, that then he became a member of the special, I'm not good in these military terms in English, Spezialregiment, special troops, special forces, Felix Dzerzhinsky, it was a special forces group. And then he was sent to the German border. And that's where he prepared a jeep, army jeep. And one day he was sitting on the floor of the jeep and pressing the pedal. And he made a construction with a mirror so that from below there he could precisely see where the jeep went. And he had trained that for a long time. And he pushed with the jeep through the border towards the west. And all his colleagues were shooting at him with machine guns, Kalashnikov. And when he survived. And when he told me this story, he said that he was absolutely convinced that they didn't want to kill him. Because he said it would have been so easy. They were so close, and there were so many that were shooting. If they would have wished to hit the car, to hit him, would have been easy. But they didn't want. That was his conviction. They didn't want to kill him. So he survived. And he came to the West, and we played music together. And that's how I learned about GDR. I didn't really learn in school. And that's how then I made friends with many of those dissidents there and brought machines there to print, to publish the Samizdat papers and so on. Why I always had friends, not only in Eastern Germany, but also in Hungary, in Russia, in Poland, that were dissidents. And this was this extremely totalitarian regime. And in 1989, it was not the military, not the Secret Service, not politicians, not the government. It was the people. It was the people that were able to overcome this wall, this iron fence or iron curtain, this whole division in Europe. Something that would have been nearly impossible for an army was possible for people that were singing, that were carrying candles, that were praying, that were absolutely peaceful. This was their strongest argument, because if there would have been violence and killing, it would have been easy for the other side. They are always stronger when it's about killing and things like that. But they are weaker when it's about thoughts, about ideas, and about everything that comes from the heart. And this, in the long run, is stronger than every military or political power. So it was possible to overcome this. The wall was teared down, and Germany and Europe came together. But this division of Europe, this was more than a physical division. This went much deeper. And the problem is that we did not really overcome the deeper division. If you allow me, I would now leave Russia and Ukraine for some time and go back a little bit. Go back more in history. Go back to the year 1917. And also, no, I'll say this quite soon. Go back to 1917. Two important historical things that happened in 1917. In Europe, there was the First World War, so all European countries' powers were completely bound in this war. In the US, in the United States, Woodrow Wilson was president, and he did two things. One is the government took the decision to enter into the war in Europe, and they made a half-a-year press campaign, media campaign, to make this possible, because American citizens did not understand why they should send their troops, their boys, to Europe. America lived in splendid isolation until that time. They had this huge country, part of a continent, that was enough for them. They didn't intervene in other parts of the world. But now the decision was different. It was, let's enter into the World War I in Europe. General Pershing was the one who led the troops to Europe. American troops came to Europe. They joined First World War. And at the same time, Woodrow Wilson gave this speech with the 14 points, which was like the key elements of a new world order. It was a program for the whole world, how the whole world could live in freedom or liberty, democracy, and peace if they would follow these 14 rules, which were quite Western, quite American thoughts, ideas. This was in the West, complete change of politics. In the East, there was the revolution, so Lenin that went through Germany, from Switzerland through Germany in the train to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, started the revolution there. There was the March Revolution, then there was the revolution in October, the war, the Bolsheviki won, and then step by step it became what we later then saw as the Soviet Union. And so in the year 1917, the world changed. And what then for decades was the ruling principle of the world, this has started in 1917. So the Western and the Eastern grip to a specific form, very different form of ruling the world. And we had in the West freedom above everything, and in the East communism, socialism, so the idea of equality above everything. Every person is equal, every person is free. And we had, now I can say it this way, in the US, you know, freedom is above all, so we are so free that one person can earn 2.7 billion euro a year. This is just the person who had the highest earnings last year, and a person, let's say 50 meters living, or 500 meters next to this person, doesn't know how to survive or what to give his children. So this is a form of freedom that doesn't really care about equality and not at all about sociality. In the East, we had this, an abstract, a forced form of sociality above everything, but this didn't care about human freedom, not at all. It was even not allowed to express your thoughts. No freedom at all. So we had two parts of the world, East and West, and they both were one-sided. And then Rudolf Steiner came. Rudolf Steiner, this incredible, let's say, spiritual teacher, a person that could enlarge the knowledge of man above what we can see and touch and feel in the material world, beyond the material, the physical world, into the living sphere, into the feeling or the soul sphere, into the spiritual sphere. This person in 1917 started to play a role in politics. he wrote a proposal. He said, if we don't overcome these thoughts, then this will have terrible results in the future. And he started with the idea of social threefolding. First, he brought this idea to the German and the Austrian emperor, because he thought, those above who have the right to decide, those are those who have the possibility to introduce that, to make this change possible. But they were not capable to understand, or if they were capable to understand, they didn't want this. So the result was nothing. And then in 1919, he started a movement, a civil society movement, and he spoke in Stuttgart in huge companies, at Mercedes-Benz, at Bosch, at all these big companies in Stuttgart. And there was a whole movement coming up. All those who were present in these meetings, they were overwhelmed. They said, never ever in life I met a person who can speak so clearly about what we need for our time. And when we listen to him, it's not only thoughts. We feel that it's much more. He feels it. I can feel it. And he's beyond this intellectual, materialistic way of thinking. There's a specific force they felt, and they wanted to be able to think and feel and act the same way. But they were not. It's very interesting, because when we look at letters they wrote to their relatives or diaries they wrote, many people said, when I listen to him, it is all clear to me. But when I come home and try to explain to my family or to my colleagues in my company, I realize that I'm not capable, because I use the old forms of thinking, the old words. It's all old stuff. And he can speak in a way that you realize he transformed all that. But I always fall back into these old forms. So that was the fate of this movement, that not enough people were able to really, to live up to it. Not only in an abstract way, understand it, but live up to it. And that then was the result that they said, please, Dr. Steiner, can we have a school for our children so that they learn to think and feel and act in such a holistic and deep way as we realize you can, but we can't, because we have never learned that. This was the start of the first Waldorf school. The very night after Steiner's second lecture in Stuttgart in the Waldorf Astoria company, they asked him, can we have that? And he said yes. So this school was built that we still have today all over the world. But Rudolf Steiner, he went much further, and he said, as long as we think that freedom, equality, and solidarity or sociality are antagonists, are opposite to each other, we will get into more and more and deeper trouble. So this is not the solution to decide either freedom or solidarity or sociality. No, we need both. And they belong together. Even more, they stand on each other. You can't have freedom without fraternity or brotherhood. You can't have brotherhood, fraternity, without freedom. So brotherhood without freedom will be a robot state, like we had in the USSR. If there's no freedom, then every person is just a robot, doing what he or she is told to do by the regime or by whoever. But if you have freedom without solidarity or sociality, then this is a fight of each against the other. It's like a war. And the idea that if every person thinks about him or herself, then we have thought about everybody, this is wrong. Because it's what can I do for you? What can you do for me? That is social. And not what can I take for me and don't care about the others. So he saw this clearly. And he not only in an intellectual way prayed or fought for freedom, equality, fraternity, he showed how they are linked together and how they can be realized. And to very briefly speak about that, whenever we think, whenever it's about ideas, whenever it's about arts, when it's about science, when it's about religion, and so on, we need absolute freedom. No one can force me to think different. No one can tell me by decision of a majority that the sum of, what is ankles? No? Ankle, okay. In a triangle is 245 degrees. It's wrong, And if the state would say that, I still would say no, I can prove why it's wrong. So this is freedom. Every person has this direct possibility to link to ideas, to the spiritual world. No one can interfere. Freedom. But equality is a completely different sphere. It's not about what I think. It's also not about what I wish. It's what is adequate between us. I'm not alone here. We are together. And how do I relate to you and you to her and we all to each other? So this is a completely different field. So he said, in cultural life, in science, in pedagogy, in arts, and so on, we need absolute freedom. But in the society, in legal life, in rights life, it's about equality. Every person is equal. No one can stand above the others. And it's even more than what we usually say that, when it comes to the law, every person is equal. No, it's more because there is no law that doesn't come from equality. Can you understand what I mean? I say it different. In modern times, in the time of consciousness soul, as Rudolf Steiner says, no law can be accepted anymore if not every person had the possibility to be part of the decision. This is the idea of democracy that started 2,500 years before our time with the first experiment, the first forms. But today it's a necessity because if we all are equal and if every person has the same dignity, then no person can be submitted or can be the object of decisions of others. We are all equal, and the laws come from what we together decide. That's the core of this idea of Rudolf Steiner. And if it comes to the third element, the third sphere, which he called the economic sphere, when it comes to economy, then it's the opposite of what we think today. Today we think, economy, that's, where I fight for myself. Economy, that's what can I take out of it? Out of the soil, out of the plants, out of the air, out of the other people. Economy, that's a form of mere egoism. No. Why do I work? When you go out here in the streets or in Utrecht or Amsterdam or wherever, and you ask people, why do you work? What will they say? I think still today, most people will say, okay, I work for my income, I work for my pension, I work for my house, for my car, for my family, for the holidays, I work for going skiing next year, and so on. So I work for myself. Interesting. Because when you look at what people do when they work, no one works for her or himself. It's impossible. We don't work for ourselves. We work for others. Whatever we do, when we work, we do it for other people. Every person. You know, when you are a baker and you bake bread, let's say 1,200, in my part of Germany it's called Semmeln, so these tiny breads that you can eat for breakfast. So when he bakes them, or the team bakes them, they can't eat them all alone. They would, you know, get ill or die or whatever. It would not be good for them. No, they bake it and they give it away. If you forget about all the ideas we have and just look at what happens, then he does it for other people. And hundreds of people come and take the semmeln and go home and eat them and are happy about that. And he can do that only because there are other people who build his house, his shop, his machines, who have woven the suit that he wears, and so on. He didn't do that himself. It's other people who've done that. So we all do what we do for other people, and we can only live because millions and millions of people work for us every day. If you just start, you know, in the morning and let's say you drink orange juice and think about, oh, where does it come from? Who has taken the orange from the tree? Who has put it in the lorry? Who has put it from the lorry in the ship? Who has put it from the ship on the lorry? Who has put it in the magazine? And so on. Many, many people were involved, worked for me until I can eat this orange. So in economic life, it's all about fraternity, about doing what I do for you and you for me. It's a form of love. It's a form of togetherness. It's a form of selflessness. It's a form of doing things for others. It's interesting because it is that way. I don't say it should be that way. I say it is that way. We all work like this. You know, I don't ask, you know, what you do, but whatever you do for others. If you don't do it for others, it's not working. It's a hobby. You know, you can sing in the bathtub. It might be your hobby. But when you sing every day, 3-4 hours, and when your voice is so brilliant, and when you work so wonderful with your voice and with songs, that you can sing Schubert or whatever at night and 800 people stand in front of the building to hear you singing, then you are a singer. Then you do it for others. Then it is your work. Otherwise, you sing in the toilet. That's good. Okay. So that's the idea that Steiner brought. And it was very clear. But what happened? The old ideologies fought back. And I would say it was not the people that listened to Steiner. It's very interesting because those who listened to Steiner, they were always supporting Steiner. It was those who did not listen to Steiner who told them, don't go there, don't listen to him. And just to give you 2 examples, in the USPD, which was the left wing of the Social Democrats at that time, the strongest leftish power in Germany, political power, they decided on a proposal that every person should be expelled, should have to leave the USPD if they would follow the ideas of Steiner. The argument for that was that Steiner might, when you listen to him, it might sound as if these ideas would be very social. But in fact, he is a friend of capitalists because Emil Molt, Leinhaas, Kühn and others, they have companies and they are friends of Steiner. And if he's a friend of these capitalists, he can only be a capitalist. Isn't that clear? It's obvious. So he is a friend of capitalists, so we need to fight him. That was their argument. On the other side, for example, Leinhaas and Unger, that both had companies, they were expelled from the Arbeitgeberverband, what is it? From the Union of Entrepreneurs. Okay. Okay. Werkgeversorganisatie. They were expelled. The argument for that was not that the ideas would be wrong. The argument was they, in their companies, they organize, can you help me? Betriebsräte? Someone else. Bedrijfsraden. Ja, Michiel. Danke. Danke wel. So, and if this is Raden, then this is a Soviet, this is Bolshevist, this is left, so we have to fight that. They never argued against his ideas because the ideas were much too strong to argue against them. They argued against the person with absolutely strange arguments. But he couldn't build up this movement fast enough because there were not enough people that were capable of really understanding it inwardly. So what happened is that the old ideologies won again. And now to make the whole story brief, what happened is that Germany fell back after the emperor had to leave, and we started with the first German democracy in 1919. But all these questions were not solved. The questions of left and right, capitalism against socialism, and it became stronger and stronger, the tension, until we had so much extremism on the streets and so on that people voted for Adolf Hitler. And by the way, never ever a majority voted for Hitler, just for you to know. It was 1/3, but he got the majority in parliament with a coalition. And the first law that he passed in parliament was the law to send parliament home. Ermächtigungsgesetz, to give all powers for 1 year to one person. But when they voted about that law, the communists were already in prison. Half of the social democrats were in prison, and so on. So terrible, terrible story. And then we had the Nationalsozialismus, the Nazi time. And we had Second World War. And in the end of Second World War, whole Europe was divided in East and West. And then for decades, we had this world order that there's East and West, but nothing else, nothing in between. And the armies of East and West were, in Germany, they had their strongest powers, and there was always this struggle, this tension, until the citizens could overcome that. But we did not overcome the systems. Just to give you one example, NATO. Because at that time we said, why do we need NATO anymore? Shouldn't we leave NATO? Then another idea won. The idea won to form out of NATO and the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe a new form where countries can be members that are afraid of each other. Can you understand that? I myself organized a movement in Germany, an initiative in Germany for a new German constitution. This is because our German constitution was just a provisoire, was only for the time when Germany was divided. And the first, preamble of this constitution says this is no constitution. We call it basic law. Why? Because the constitution can only be given by the people, but the people were not allowed to do it. Part of the people in East Germany couldn't join this decision. So we said, okay, let's do just a basic law for the time being until all Germans can vote on their constitution. So the preamble said this, and the last article of our basic law, Article 149 said, this constitution, this provisory constitution, ends the day or terminates the day when all Germans are capable to decide about their own constitution. That's also the reason why there was no popular vote on the basic law, because we said this we can only do when all Germans can vote. So I referred to that history and that article, and the organization that I founded at that time became the first and biggest East-West citizen initiative we ever had. We collected 1.7 million signatures for Germany being united on the basis of a new constitution that would be voted by all Germans in East and West. And we organized for 2 years conferences in East and West about the new constitution. And one article we drafted at that time was the article. We have an article in our basic law that allows us to be a member of the NATO. We changed that article and we said Germany can be part of a security system as long as it unites European countries that die voreinander Schutz suchen, that want to defend or their security by the other or from the other, together in a united form of security. And this proposal was voted in the committee that we had for this in Germany. Together, it was a committee from Bundestag, our parliament, and members of all parliaments of our Länder, our states. And we had a majority for this new proposal. But we needed 2/3, and we didn't get the 2/3. We were very close to that. So the majority in Germany was convinced that we have to find a new form now, together. And I don't know whether you remember that. Remember Gorbachev? He spoke about the common house of Europe. Let's form a new form of security together. That was his proposal. Yeltsin he wrote a letter to NATO under which conditions Russia could join the NATO if NATO would change their concept of security. We made a treaty, the Russia-NATO Act, we call it. And we organized a new system that we called Partnership for Freedom, where Russia became member. And we told the Russians this membership would be the first step of the creation of this new form of common security together in whole Europe. This was 2000, it started in 1990, but still in 2001, there was a conference on that. And there was a long time when people East and West met about the question, how can we do that? But there was always strong resistance from the old powers and the old forms of thinking. And it ended in 2008 when George W. Bush, so the son, not the father was part of these thoughts. And we, Germany and also the US and France and Great Britain, assured Russia that NATO would stop at the German border and would never go eastward. NATO would not go to the east. And the idea was, can we create for this huge part of Europe new forms of security? And then in 2008, this stopped because George W. Bush offered to Ukraine and Georgia the option to become members of NATO. At that time, at the NATO summit, Germany, France, and many other European governments voted against the American proposal to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, because they knew this would be like a form of aggression. Remember when Russia send nuclear rockets to Cuba, what this meant for the US, that immediately, directly close to the United States of America, they would have these forces. So it was clear that Russia would not like Western troops to closer and closer come to Russia. And please, when I say this is no excuse at all for anything that Russia or Putin does now. No excuse at all. Only that I know, if we would have done what we wished, what people wished, what the time had asked for at that time, to overcome this system of Cold War, to find security and peace together and not against each other, this would not have happened. That's the truth. So then, as you know, NATO expanded within the years from 1999 to 2020. 14 new countries joined the NATO, Central and Eastern European countries. So the NATO doubled from 16 to 30, nearly doubled. And Russia felt more and more locked in and in a terrible situation, difficult situation. But it's also a problem that the Russian system and politics is not at all appealing to people, so that they cannot convince by having a system where everybody says, okay, I want to be part of that. They all wanted to leave that. They all wanted to be part of the West. But Europe is not West. Europe is not East. If you look at the world from here, from Europe, then there is East and West, but there's a need that there's something in between. And this is always, there's not good and bad, there's not black and white, there always needs to be a form of development. And Europe has this task for a long time, to overcome this antagonism, to bring together what was highlighted in the West, freedom, highlighted in the East, sociality, can you say that? To bring it together and to overcome the one-sidedness in creating a form of living together where we have freedom, equality, and fraternity all together. This is the European idea, this is the European task, and this is what Rudolf Steiner tried a bit more than 100 years ago. It's a part of our history that's nearly forgotten. Strange, because it was very important at that time, but you don't find it in history books. Although it's the strongest idea, I think, that came up in the last century on how to solve these problems. And now we stand there and we have this war, and it's the question whether we can overcome it. And it's clear that this war cannot be won in the field, cannot be won by weapons. I mean, also, even if you look at it from the side of Russia, it can't be won. If they lose, it will be a disaster, but if they win, it will be an even bigger disaster, because Ukrainians will never accept Russian ruling over Ukraine. And they lost their face. They lost their face everywhere. So all the countries around, even those who still felt quite close to Russia or were quite close to Russia, they now have seen the face of the so-called brother, the big brother that acts towards the little brother in Ukraine in this violent manner. And this means that Russian power will vanish. And the only question is there a way out without more killings and more victims? Is there a way to solve this. And just very briefly, I would say that a solution cannot be the victory of one side. It can only be the victory of the free individuality, the victory of self-determination in Ukraine, to allow Ukraine to go their own way, but at the same time not be part of one of the blocs. So this idea of, can we bring Ukraine in our bloc, or do you manage to bring it in your bloc? This is a terrible idea. Ukraine is a country of its own, and they should be allowed to take their own decisions. But this can be a neutral country. And it could be the beginning of more and more neutrality in Europe. We already have Finland, we have Switzerland, for example. Switzerland in the center of Europe as a neutral country. And I think no one is against this neutrality. Everybody is happy that we have at least one country that is not a threat to others, where you can meet and can negotiate, for example, when there are tensions in other countries. It's good to at least have Switzerland. So Switzerland is in the center of Europe, but Ukraine is in the center of Eurasia, has always been seen as this heartland in this bigger continent. And if we open the path for Ukraine to become a neutral status, so not be a threat for one or the other side anymore, this could open the pathway for Europe as such to create new forms of security, of living together, of creating peace together, and not of again and again preparing for war and creating new tensions. Let me take one next step, and let me say that this now was a quite topic talk about the situation of today. And one can wonder, one can ask the question, can we, should we, as anthroposophists, talk about things like that in such a way? Or shouldn't we be calm and maybe only express our sorrows, our Mitleid, compassion, thank you. No. I think that's the very difference between anthroposophy and nearly all other spiritual ways that at least I know in our time. That's a huge difference. Most of these spiritual paths, they promise us that there's a way where we can more and more flee this terrible reality on earth, and we can live in another sphere. And this can give us a lot of inner warmth and light and so on. Anthroposophy is different, because anthroposophy doesn't want to bring this light for me, but for all of us, for the people. Anthroposophy always means to engage. Anthroposophy means to change the reality we live in, to work for the better, to improve the world we live in. This means to act, not only to talk, not only to think, to act for peace, for freedom, for equality, for solidarity. And there are so many people who do that. And it's interesting. I had a meeting with a spiritual leader of another big spiritual movement in Europe. I'm not going to say who it was, because I'm not sure whether he would like to be mentioned publicly, where he said, it's interesting, you know, we have this wonderful spiritual path and we have so many people who follow it, but we have no practice. You know what he means? You have biodynamic agriculture. You have Waldorf pedagogy. You have anthroposophical medicine. You have anthroposophical social impulse, threefolding. We have nothing like that. And I have to admit, we all send our children to Waldorf schools. And when we buy something, we go and look for Demeter. And when my wife is ill, she goes to the Anthroposophical hospital. Because you have this. And he asked, how is this possible? How can you really link spirituality to this form of practice, these very real, concrete things? And that's the uniqueness, and at the same time, that's the inner core of anthroposophy. That it's not a way of fleeing Earth or fleeing our real life. That it's a way of better understanding why I'm here and what we are here to do for. Better being able to do what I have to do in this world through anthroposophy, not fleeing. And also to understand that there's never a way back. Always a way, only a way forward. So if we look at history, we can say that, if we go very much back for a moment, I'll be very fast with that. If we go very much back, then the Bible tells the story of the paradise. If you look to other religions, to other myths in other parts of the world, they all have similar pictures. They all have a picture that in the beginning, we all were one. It's interesting. We all were one. We lived in unity. We lived in a wholeness. We were part of that wholeness. We were not divided. And when I say not divided, I don't just mean by each other. I also mean we were not divided from all what was around and with us, and not divided from God. And you can, at some places of this earth, find people that still partly live in this form of consciousness. So I was able to several times be in Papua New Guinea, or Irian Jaya, as it is called right now, which you might know because you're closer to this part of the world than Germany is. So it's, since 1974, it's ruled by the Indonesians, by Indonesia. And this is the least developed part of the world. This is a part where there are about 600, we think, people with 600 different languages, where 400 have been found yet, and scientists think there are still 200 more that they didn't find. And when you live with these people, then, when they go and cut a tree, this is not just something, I cut it and sell it. No, they speak with the tree. They pray. They ask the tree whether it's now time for him, and whether the tree wants to become a boat or not. And if the tree doesn't want to become a boat, okay, he can stand there. They go to another tree. And they ask whether the tree wants to become a chair. They are related to the tree. So when I was there, and that was the reason why I then came back several times, the Indonesian government sold 70,000 hectares to Scott Paper Mills, an American paper company, and they just, they cut the trees, the tropical rainforest, to make paper out of it. And in order to be able to do that, these people had to leave. So they told the people, we sold the land. But the people didn't understand. Because in their concept, it's not possible. The idea to buy and sell land doesn't exist. So they didn't understand what these Indonesian officials told them. They just remained there. And then they came with arms. And they shot them. Many, many people were shot. And no one here in Europe would know because there was no CNN reporting. There was nobody there, the tropical rainforest, at that time. Then they discussed, but they said, no, we can't leave. And they couldn't leave because they are responsible for this country. They are linked to this country. The river is not just, what is it, HO2 or so? It's not material, it's a spirit. It's a being. And their ancestors live there. And the mountains and the trees and the animals, they all belong to them and they have a role there. They can't just leave. So this is a specific early form of consciousness. And we all lived in that form sometime. And then more and more awoke in this very world, in this materialistic world. So the Bible puts it in the picture of Adam and Eve leaving the paradise. Why? Because there was just one rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge. Yeah? So you can only be part of the wholeness of the all one if you don't eat from the tree of knowledge, which they did, and they had to leave. And you know, what does it mean? When you leave, this means you're out. And then this new relation to the world begins, where here am I, and there's you. And there's this chair, and there's this wall, and there's the world. I am not part of it. The world is outside myself. This is the new concept. And it's always, I'm here, and here is the other. That's our understanding of the world. And we gained knowledge more and more, and we developed techniques, and by science and technique, we learned to rule the world, to use it, to, how do you say, to possess it, to submit it under our will, to do what we want with the world. And now today, we realize that this is not possible anymore. Because if we go on like that, we are going to kill the world, ourselves, society. We are on our way to ruin everything. We are destroying what we live on, in, and by, completely. And we live in a time of crisis. I would say it's a multitude of crises, not one crisis. The public awareness always has one crisis. So now it's Ukraine. Before, it was pandemic. Do you remember before that it was the climate? But what happened to the climate? Was it solved? No. What happened to the ecological crisis? What happened to the social crisis? Was it solved? No. It's not one crisis after the other. It's one crisis on the other. It's a multitude of crises. And I would say all these crises, they are there to make us wake up. It's like, you know, like a huge sign that is put into my way, saying, stop. Don't go on that way. It's a sign of how can I say, self-knowledge, self-understanding. I need to understand where I stand, what I do. But we don't do that. So we take every sign aside and go on. It's like a train that is on the railway and goes on and on. This is the terrible thing. Because we are capable to change every moment, every day. We are capable to change. No one else. And we now live in a world where we cannot say, you know, it's not me. I'm not responsible. It's them. They are responsible. So they should make the change. No. Today, every person is responsible. We are all responsible. And wherever we show, you know, if I show at you, 3 fingers show back at me. So this is the time we live in. And if I talked about the social crisis as the elder one, elder than ecological crisis, pandemic, and so on, is the social crisis solved? Let me just give you one figure. Just from the time of pandemic, during the time of pandemic, precisely saying from March 2020 until November 2021, so in 1 year and a half, the richest 10 people of the world could double their wealth, and 160 million people fell in poverty. So they were added to the millions that already lived in poverty. So during this terrible time, more and more this divide. Thanks for helping. Wonderful. This divide got bigger and bigger. It was not, brought narrow closer to it. It was bigger and bigger. Every day it gets bigger. Whilst we are sitting here, it gets bigger and bigger. It's like a machine. It's like a mechanism. Do you understand what I mean? It's like nobody wants it. That's the interesting thing. Nobody wants it. I'm not on the side of those who think there's a person or a group of people behind everything that happens, who wish what happens and then think, oh, okay, I do this and then, no. It's interesting because the system we created more and more works in a way that the system rules over the people and not the people over the system. Take money. Money is wonderful. In medieval times when I wanted to buy a lute, so an instrument to play, and had a pick to sell, I needed to find a person that needed the pick and had a lute. But then someone had the idea to create money and I could sell the pick and get the money and then go and buy the best lute. It's intelligent. So money as a means between us that helps us to express these relations when we do things for each other and share things. Wonderful. But then, one day, money became something else. Money became a commodity. And with money, you could make money. And now, 98% of the money that goes around the world is not related to any economic reality anymore. Not related to something people do or need. It's just speculative money, 98%. So we created a monster, and the monster becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. Or let me take another example. When friends of mine, young people, create businesses, then they all have the problem, when you want to do something real, something good, something big, you need money. When you need money, you have to take someone in who has the money. If you don't have the money yourself or very, very rich parents, then you need to take in capital in any form. So venture capital today, they demand rates. They want to get 8 times, 10 times back what they have given. Because they say, okay, I give you the money. If you're successful, no problem, you give it back to me. If not, if I lose, I have 20 such young businesses, 18 fail. So the 2 ones that are successful need to bring me so much money so that I can live with the losses. So you are completely dependent by those who give you the money. And then when you are successful, the next thing that happens is they buy you out. And then it's their company. Let me just mention one company in this world, BlackRock. Maybe some of you know it. BlackRock started in 1999 with a invested capital of $300 million. Today, they have 7.8 trillion US dollar invested capital. In all 50 German companies that are at the stock market, BlackRock is an investor. In more than 2/3, it's the biggest investor. When Bayer bought Monsanto, did someone remember that? Monsanto, glyphosate, Roundup, terrible product. So it made no sense, in my opinion, no sense at all for Bayer to buy this. It was like this. So, but Bayer did that. I wanted to understand. So what did I do? I looked at who owns Bayer, who owns Monsanto. So the biggest investor at Bayer is BlackRock. BlackRock is the second biggest in Monsanto. The biggest in Monsanto is Capital Street. Capital Street is the third biggest in Bayer. The second biggest in Bayer is Vanguard. Vanguard is the third biggest in Monsanto. It's the same companies who own these companies, the same trusts, funds, and so on. And today it's not anymore about, about persons that do what they think is the best. It's about companies who own companies, and to tell them, if you don't, let's say, by 1 year, bring me, let's say, 15% on my invested capital, then this will be your end. So we have privatization of hospitals, for example, and they go around. Yeah. Okay. And they go around and say, okay, how much time do you need for a hip operation? 90 minutes. From today on, 60. So that's the way they work. And we all suffer under this. We all suffer under this. And then if we go around and find the person who's responsible, we won't find it. Because the more we go up, those on top, they also say, I'm in this, in this rat's race, and there's this companies that tell me I need to do this and that. You don't find the person anymore. Why do I say this? Because to find the right way to live together is maybe the most important things that we have to do on earth. I need to find a way to live with myself, but I have to find a way to live together with others, to organize society in a form that we can have freedom, equality, fraternity, or brother and sisterhood. This is of utmost importance. But we don't do it, and we don't feel responsible for it, because we still think it's others who are responsible for it. But that's wrong. It's up to us. And we need to take responsibility for our world, for the world we live in. And every time we miss the moment and miss the task, it will have bad results, as we see it in Ukraine right now, for example. So anthroposophy is an inner path, is a path of inner development, and anthroposophy is a path of engagement in this world, making this world a better place. And all over the world, you find anthroposophists doing great things. It's incredible, because whenever I find a good idea and look who's behind, very often it's anthroposophists. Let me just give two very brief examples. We had the social sciences section meeting at Dornach last week, and I invited two friends of mine. One friend, he started as a Waldorf student by living without money for 5 years, because he said money is evil. He wanted to make this experiment. Can I live without money? He toured the whole world, traveled around the whole world without money. It was a great experience. And then he started in Germany a business. It's a very big business now, where it's all about food that would be thrown away to make it useful for other people. He started alone, and now it's hundreds of thousands of people, and it's growing and growing and growing. Brilliant thing. Another friend of mine, he couldn't come to our meeting in Dornach because 2 weeks before we met in Dornach, he started something new. He had started a brilliant company. Don't have the time now to tell you. But then he saw Ukraine, and he saw, okay, the first victims come. The first people flee, the first people, refugees come from Ukraine to our countries, so we need to do something. So what he built up is called Unterkunft Ukraine. So he created a movement that right now found more than 300,000 beds for Ukrainians. They organized this all, and it's one former Waldorf student that organized it. And it was started in Germany, now it spreads through other European countries. You know, every day we can start by having an idea, an impulse, and doing it. Not just having the idea, but doing it. Every idea that, you know, we have and think we should do, but then don't do, weakens us and the world. Let's take these ideas serious. Let's see that we live in a world where we need exactly this, people bringing the ideas, which is the impulses of the spiritual world in this real world, and changing the reality we live in. We live in a reality where everything got encrusted, everything got stiff and hard by us making systems and regimes that are not governed by men anymore, that have their own regime. And we need to change that into a form of living together as human beings, free, equal, and socially. Thank you so much. Valentina, do you want to?